Hi, in this tutorial we're going to look at exporting information from Maya and taking it directly into After Effects, specifically the movement of your camera and the position of some objects in the world. So if we take a look at a scene like this, where we have these two objects, the ground, you can see that I have a path here that I'm going to use for my camera, but you'll also note that I have these two locators, one here and one here. And these are positioned because this is where I want to add something, a two-dimensional object to my scene that I don't want to render in 3D, like text for a label or an image to be projected onto this box or appear to be projected onto this box. But I want to be able to switch those things in After Effects rather than putting them directly into the render. So what we want to end up with is something like this. So you can see that where there was nothing here before except for these two locators, here now we have a text object and an image. And you can see that if I move here and I advance through the timeline that they're actually following the camera, although they are two-dimensional objects, a photo and a text layer. So there's nothing really difficult about this, but it's just a little bit finicky. So let's go back into Maya and see what we have to do. Now, first of all, we need a camera. So I'll just create a simple camera, and I'm going to attach it to this curve as a motion path. And you can figure that stuff out. One thing to note is that you might want to copy the camera that you export into After Effects, because one thing we have to do here is bake the animation of this camera, which means to put a keyframe on every frame for the position and rotation of this camera, and that will take it away from the motion path and it will just follow those keyframes. But After Effects needs those keys for this to work properly. So you may want to duplicate this camera or make a second camera and parent and orient constrain it to the original, bake that one, and then you're still left with the original on the curve. Well, let's just do that just to make it easier. So we can see here that the camera is moving along here, starting at frame 1 and going to frame 90. But like I say, this can cause some problems in in After Effects if we don't do this properly. Here we go. So this is our camera, so this is shot, and we'll call this original. And then I'm going to create a new camera and call it shot bake. And I'll constrain the shot bake to the original one, so I'm going to want to point constrain it and also orient constrain it with no maintain offset. So it's just going to follow along. So we want to make sure that we're going to bake the camera called shot bake. So what we have to do is select that camera, go to edit, keys, and bake simulation. Now this we want to make sure that we get right. So what do we want to bake? Well, we want to bake, translate, and rotate, so we'll select those in the channel box. We want to go from start to end. Now here it's 0 to 90. I want to make sure this is set from 1 to 90. And I think that is everything. So I'll just bake and it will run through the animation. And you can see in the timeline here now it's left behind just a series of keyframes. So Now let's see how this works. We're going to save this scene. And I've already rendered out the images from this camera's point of view, so you can see here that if I look in my documents, I've already got a series of images here that are the renders from that camera's point of view. Okay, so let's go back into After Effects and we'll start a new project. I'm not going to save that. I'm just going to double click in the project window and I want to import the Maya scene. Ignore this one for now, the one called Camera Export. So I'm going to open that and it brings in composition with some stuff in it. If we look down here in the timeline, we've got two cameras, the bake shape and the original shape. I'm just going to delete the original shape one because we don't need that. And then there's a null cylinder shape and null box shape, which reminds me of some very important information that I forgot to pass on. These two null objects have to be named null underscore something. So one's called null underscore cylinder, the other is called null underscore box. And if you imagine that I'm going to put a plane here with some text on it, I want it to be this locator to be positioned where the top left corner of that image or text will be. So it's not the center, but it's the top left corner. So if I want to put a plane that's going to appear on the face of this box, that's why I've positioned the locator here. If you don't name it properly, then After Effects won't recognize it as a location in 3D space. So you can see that it's brought our Maya camera in as a After Effects camera, and it's brought in our two null objects as points in space. It's turned them into 3D shapes for us. So now we just have to import those images. Okay, so I'll just drag these in here. Pop in, I'll put them underneath everything. So you can see that these red lines here are our locators and they're placed in the appropriate spot. And if we move the animation, they follow, but not quite. So something weird is happening here. Let's go back to Maya for a second and just check out what's happening. Right now, I rendered it at 24 frames per second. Normally, I'd switch to 30 frames per second, but I forgot. So let's go back into After Effects, and we have to check two things. First, we have to check the composition settings. So if we select the composition settings, we can see that After Effects is reading this as 24 frames per second, which is good. But we also have to look at the imported sequence of images. So if we go to Interpret Footage, Main, and this is on the images themselves, you can see that they assume the frame rate is 30 frames per second. So that should be 24. So now if we play the animation, you can see that it stays right where it's supposed to. So you have to make sure that your composition frames per second matches the images frame per second, and both of those have to match what came out of Maya. So I was working at 24 frames per second, so I had to make sure all three match at 24 frames per second. So these red lines don't look much like locators anymore, but it's really just because they're so enormous. So we just change our scale to something like 5. So I'm just hitting S to open up scale here. 5. So you can see them as planes here, but they're rotated in the wrong direction. I probably could have solved this in Maya by rotating my locators 90 degrees or negative 90 degrees about the y-axis, but I can solve it here too. So I can just hit R for rotate on each of these, and the Y rotation here, I happen to know that it's negative 90 degrees. There'll probably be some 90 degrees in some direction, probably around the y-axis in your case too. R for the cylinder shape, Y rotation, negative 90. There, so now they're matching, and if we scrub through the animation, it's good they're not quite the right size yet. This one doesn't matter too much. but I will change it a little bit so it's a little smaller. Oops. These are locked, so if I want to stretch them out one way or the other, I have to unlock them, but I don't really need to do that. I'll set it to 3. And then the plane on the box here, the scale I found through experimentation, I think should be something like 4.65. Nope, let's try 3.65. A little too small. 3.7. 3.8. Anyway, we can change this afterwards, but it's something like that. Maybe it's actually 4. It's a little big. 3.95. But you can see that the scale of these things is not determined beforehand, and you've got to change them to match. However, we're going to have to scale something else soon too. So first of all, we want to put some text here. So how do we do that? We create a new layer, new text layer, and we create some text, and then we want to make this a child of this null object, and we do that in After Effects by grabbing this little spiral under the parent column and dragging it down. And so I'm selecting the one beside the text. I'm dragging it down to what I want to be its parent, which is the null cylinder shape. Now nothing seems to have changed, but I still have to make the text a 3D layer. So if I click on 3D layer here, it seems to disappear, but in fact it's just the scales are too big. So if we just change this down to 4, and then we still can't see it. If we go to P for position, can change these, and now it's here. And then also A for anchor point, so that looks right. And then the scale probably just has to be a little bit bigger. So the position has to be set to 0 essentially on the text layer, and the scale has to be adjusted so it's the right size. Now you can see it's sitting above my plane here, so I can just adjust the position of it in the y-axis. I can do it that way. I could also adjust the anchor point. If I hit A, you can move it so the anchor point is at the top part of the H, and then position can go back to 0. So whichever way you want, adjusting the anchor point or the position will work to get it where we want it to, and then we can move the scale around. So now if we look here at the animation, oops, if we look here, you can see that the text is following along perfectly, so you could use this to label. And of course, this is just like any other object. I can set keys on transparency, so I can fade it up, fade it down, change the color, change the text, and I don't have to go back to 3D to render. So now if I want to put an image on this box, I can import an image. And again, I need to bring it into my scene. It's too big, obviously. But I'm not going to worry about that now. I'm going to make it a 3D object, and I am going to make it a child of the null box shape by dragging the little spiral down here. And then we also have to go in, change its scale, and change its position. There it is. And now it's seemingly rotated on the wrong axis here, so just change the orientation to 0. And then A for anchor point, I want this to be 0, 0 in this case, and it fits just where we want it. And then I can set the scale to whatever size is appropriate. And again, I have to do a little experimentation here, something like 6.65. And now these things, if all goes well, oops, just going to make sure that the appropriate spot in the timeline, that these things follow along the camera. And of course, because they are layers in After Effects, I can easily change them. I can swap in something else. I can change the text. So it opens up a lot of possibilities, and we don't have to go back into 3D. So this is one way to do this. Another way you might want to look at for doing this actually is much easier. Somebody's written a great tool called the Sunday Toolset, and there's a Maya to After Effects plugin. So you can look that up, and it does exactly what I've done here. But even without that, if you don't have access to it for some reason, you can follow these instructions and export your camera and null object positions from Maya into After Effects to add two-dimensional objects into your 3D scene. Thanks.